the Public Productivity and Performance Handbook is the third edition of what began as the Public Productivity Handbook in 1992. The intent of the handbook is really to bring together the best minds, the practitioners and scholars in terms of how to maintain high-performing government. The premise is really that as public administrators, we really need to deliver on government's promises. Those are the promises that have been made by politicians, legislators, various elected officials, chief executives for many, many years. In the United States, at least 250 years, let's say, and just as long around the world under various forms of government. So the handbook is really focused on best practices, how you distill those best practices into actual improvement plans, strategic plans, and how you maintain faith with the population, with citizens in terms of what government has promised over a long period of time. Without going into all the details of the handbook, I just want to say that we have, three sets of authors with us today from the handbook. Others are participating in other parts of the program today. And what they have done is to distill the experiences that they are familiar with, that they have researched, point where it could be applied anywhere around the world. So I refer you to that compendium, which I edited with Andrew Ballard, and just advise you that it's available much more cheaply on as an ebook sense. So not to worry about the hard copy in a sense. What idea is we want to share the experience. We want to get it out there, and that this really leads to two things that we have to pay attention to today, and we have to build throughout what you might call the performance movement. One is, how do we access best practices? How do people in the US understand what's happening in Bangladesh, for example, as Professor Trivedi has pointed out? Well, we don't have good conduits for that. Today is perhaps a beginning along those lines, but we need to make those available. We also need to make available best practices in the US or any place around the world to other countries. So part of the handbook deals with a search strategy for finding those best practices, which provide very valuable advice at very little cost. Basically, a search strategy on the web where you can combine a search for best practices, award-winning projects, recognized projects with keywords that you need. Because one of the problems we have, and that we are trying to overcome through this series of conferences and through publications and journals, is how do you connect measurement to improvement? It's a great deal of work on measurement, but how do you actually make a change in terms of tangible improvement? And part of that is finding models to work with, not just relying on your own experience, within a particular service sector. The other question that's implied by GEPRA, which started off really as a congressionally related initiative, is how do you incentivize elected officials to really be interested in, to value, to prioritize performance management, let's say. And we haven't had enough discussion of that. It's inherent in GEPRA, it's inherent in some of the presentations we just saw, but how do you make it as important to them as the budget? Which I think, the budget is a primary document, a primary decision-making tool for them. So how do you make legislators' lives easier, if you will? How do you make their achievements more tangible to the population? How do you get them on board so that the adoption of performance projects doesn't then peter out in terms of implementation? Which is a study that I published with Patria de Lanza-Jones many years ago, and she will be the incoming president of the American Society for Public Administration. So we have 3 sets of presentations. I'll ask each of the presenters to limit it to 10 minutes, so we have time for questions, which Professor Manaharan, I think, can then see on the chat. And I'll introduce them before each of their presentations. So the first presentation is by Alan Shark, and Dr. Alan Shark is the executive director of the CompTIA Public Technology Institute in Washington, D.C., and he has been since 2004. He's a fellow of the National Academy for Public Administration, chair of the Standing Panel on Technology Leadership there. He's an associate professor for the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and he's also the host of the popular bi-monthly podcast Shark Bites, and a colleague of ours at the National Center for several decades. So let me turn this over to Professor Shark. So
thank you.
Barry?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. And what an impressive group we are. Let me share my screen and recognize that it's Earth Day. So happy Earth Day to everybody. What an interesting day to have this conversation. I'm going to take a different direction, and I am going to go back to the chapter, which is the best chapter in this book, chapter 27. I'm joking, of course, where I talk about, for good measure, has anything changed? And so what I like to do is take a different approach. What we've discussed so far, and I find it fascinating, is process, commitment, how we got from point A to point B to point C, and frameworks. Really important. But there are some other aspects I'd like to bring to the conversation having to do with what is going on now in the States, at least. And there's an interesting but mixed picture. For example, where I live, Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., some great things are happening. The city of Alexandria has a wonderful website on performance measurement where I could look at any one of these different areas that you're seeing on the screen and be able to zero in and look at information provided to them from a chief performance officer. This didn't happen overnight. This was a journey that probably took 5 years to get to, but it's become very popular and a good model of what can be done, sharing it with the public. We have data.gov, and you'll see where I'm coming from in a minute. We have websites like performance.gov, which is part of the president's management agenda here in the US. We have COVID throughout the world. Here is just one map, and we're realizing the power of visualized data. Again, I'm painting a picture. We now have a new federal CDO council, Chief Data Officer, which is kind of emerging and becoming more and more prominent within the governance structure. And then we have even evaluation.gov that gets into many of the things that we're talking about today, at least using the federal government's example in this country, where you have evaluation officers in all these different agencies that go back to the Evaluation Act, as they call it, where they've just now starting to implement how does this evidence-based policymaking fit in with all the other things that we're doing. So this raises some interesting questions. Number one, performance improvements begin with data collection, and I see a real disconnect. The word data was hardly mentioned in the previous conversations. It was alluded to. We kind of take it for granted, but there's a whole other ecosystem of data folks and technology folks that are really not being part of this discussion. And that's something that I think is a lost opportunity that could quickly be saved and resurrected. So I think data is what drives everything, and the letter D for data comes before the letter E. for evaluation. So we do have incredible tools for improvement. We have this thing called big data. We have open data. In fact, open data really opened up the doors to big data later on. And I remember talking to open data folks, and I say, why are you doing this? They said, well, we want to make data available to the public so they can make intelligent decisions. Well, the reality is very few people wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to see my local or state or federal government's open data site. It's great for research. It does serve a purpose, but it doesn't help if it doesn't tie back to better data-driven decisions. And that's kind of where we are today. We're moving in that direction where data is now being used in much more productive ways. And we've seen an explosion in the technologies of visualized data. Used to be called GIS, but it's so much more than just geographic type of data. We have the Internet of Things that is giving us all sorts of inflection points in terms of data usage, transportation, and health as ways never before. And now we have issues like data governance. What are the policies that govern all of this? And advanced analytics going the next step, which is how do we analyze it? Who analyzes it? And who do we share it with? Then we have cloud, tech, and access, which is a huge game changer. All these things have really happened and accelerated in the last 10 years, just a decade. Then we have our Muni websites and mobile apps that provide citizens with real-time information and data. And there is a hunger for quote unquote practical information. The biggest leap probably has to do with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Picture an octopus and sitting on top of mounds and mounds of data that every inch of its tentacles is sucking in all this data. And finally, we can look at data. We can look for anomalies. We can look for trend analysis in microseconds, which it could take us weeks, if not a year. This is a game changer for us who like to look at data, figure out how to best use it for better decision making. And this is where the intersection of performance measurement comes into play, because this is a vital component to that. If we're collecting it, where does data measurement come in? Where does evaluation come in? How do these forces come together? I don't have the answers, but I can tell you this is a problem. And then we have data performance improvement mindset. It's out there, but it's dispersed. We don't have a collective wisdom thought process in all of this. So we have the tools as never before, but it's still about people and culture. It's about accountability and leadership, that has been mentioned, but there is a disconnect between performance measurement and technology. We can't have this as a separate tandem type of relationship. Technologists could be one's best friend here and vice versa. Then we have this issue of outputs versus outcomes, something that a joint NAPA panel event will address on May 20th. And for those of you who tune in to the National Academy for Public Administration, you may want to attend this. It's open to all. And it's going to be an event that explores these very things about the evaluative process, how we've gone astray, and why are we still having these discussions when all these tools are available. And then we have reporting, which is kind of related to the other one, which is more about checkoff boxes. It's what is the meanings that we can take away from this to actually affect improvement. The other problem is that comes back to what I said earlier. We have too many hardened silos. Silos are actually good. Management studies continue to inform us that we work best in tribes. In fact, the ideal number is 12. So having silos is probably a good thing, but they shouldn't be hardened. We need to figure out ways to have inter-silo communications. Imagine that as a new title, inter-silo communication officer. But that function is sorely needed. And that's where management at the top echelons can help make a difference here. And then we have an obligation as a professor that takes this seriously in teaching schools of public affairs administration. How are we training the next generation of public managers so that this is actually embedded as part of their DNA? So I wanted to be short. I am, and I'm going to give my time back to the panel. So hopefully we can have some meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Alan. You set a new bar here for an efficient and effective presentation. Okay, I think I'd just like to hold the questions to the end, and then all of our panelists can respond to any of the questions that pop up. So, so our next presentation is by Katherine, Barrett, and Richard Greene. So over the course of over 30 years, Katherine, Barrett, and Richard Greene, who were the principals of Barrett and Greene Incorporated, have researched, analyzed, and written about state and local governments. They're nationally known authorities in a host of topics, including budgeting, finance, human resources, workforce management, tax system, data use, and especially performance management. Early 2020, their latest book, Making Government Work, The Promises and Pitfalls of Performance-Informed Management, was published by Roman and Littlefield. So let's give them the floor, the screen, whatever. And I believe that you know, you'll find their presentation very valuable, and this is their book. So it is as far as I'm concerned, it is the most readable book on performance. It's out there, the book that is most relevant to practice. So thank you. So Katherine, Richard.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's kind of you to hold up our book. We'd like to think what we bring to this game and to the symposium today is a little bit of historical knowledge. There's a great deal of historical knowledge among the panelists and the various sessions. We've been working at this field for the better part of 32 years, 33 years, something like that, during which time we've interacted with and observed what's happening in the performance management field in all 50 states, in all the large cities in the United States of America, and in most of the large counties. We haven't kept quite as close a track on the counties, but we've kept track on a number of them. When we first started down this path, we were introduced to the field by the likes of Harry Hattrey, Jay Fountain, Jonathan Brule, and John Kaminsky, who everyone will grow more acquainted with subsequently when he gives a keynote address today. All of them were pioneers in the field. And on the basis of their work, we became zealots. And we thought, gee, all you needed to do was measure things and the world would turn on its head. And then it turned out that wasn't so true. Clearly, the extreme view that we initially held when we were naive and young and believed that the world could change on the course of a dime and on the course of a new technology or new effort wasn't rooted in reality. As the years passed, we saw many programs develop and then fail to continue and then pop up again. We saw the frustration of getting elected officials to pay attention and getting managers to buy in. Many of the issues we saw at the state and local level were paralleled by the issues over the course of time with the GPRA. But we're still optimists that done properly, performance management can make a huge difference. It makes a difference when performance information is actively used to drive policy and improve services. There are lots of obstacles, though, that keep performance management functioning in an optimal way. Katherine?
Sure. You know, so much of the fascinating conversations this morning have been about the big picture and setting up the systems. We're really going to talk about what we've seen on the ground. Rich said we're optimistic. We are. Here's one quick example of how New Orleans used data to manage, understand, and prioritize service delivery. And that's a key way we're now seeing performance management in action. We couldn't agree more with Dr. Shark about the importance of data to this exercise. So we'll give you a little of the New Orleans example. In that city, a 2014 fire tragically took the lives of 5 people, including 3 children. And it was in a house that did not have smoke detectors. And the idea of people at the time was that the smoke detectors, if they were there, could have saved the children and their parents. The fire department was faced with a conundrum, and it was a conundrum that they were able to start to solve with data. They were giving out smoke detectors for free, but many homes still went without. To deal with this problem in 2015, a performance team started analyzing data on where fires were occurring. And they discovered through the data, through their performance measurements, that often places where elderly residents and children live. And so that's what they decided to prioritize. The city used that data to single out the homes at highest risk. Staffers focused their attention on visiting those places and optimize the chances that these residents would be more likely to accept the free detectors. And there was a payoff. A few months later, a fire broke out in one of the houses that had received a free smoke detector, and there wasn't a single fatality, demonstrating the value of the data to the fire department and ultimately the safety of residents who were now much less likely to lose homes or live or their lives to an errant match. One other benefit to this was that it won over the fire chief. The fire chief, who had seen performance measurement as a bother, now saw really its worth. We love stories like that, and there are a great many of them. But it's a mistake to assume that all performance data automatically translates into cleaner, happier states or localities. There are lots of obstacles that keep performance management functioning in an optimal way. And for example,
I think this is a little bit unfair because Katherine gets to tell you good news, and now she hands it over to me to tell you some negative things. But one of the issues, one of the challenges is that an overabundance, and we see this all over the place, an overabundance of performance measures and data points can usually and often leave the potential users drowning in far more information than is remotely reasonable. And again, going back to what Dr. Sharp was saying, technology may be one of the answers to this, one of the aids in solving this. I'll tell you a story about Inger Brink. Many of you in the audience may be familiar with her. She ran Results Washington beginning at the end of, I guess it was May of 2017. At the end of that period of time, departments would prepare in-depth slideshows to share a selection from 192 distinct performance measures that were collected. But only one or two of the measures would be discussed at each meeting. As she told us, and I'm going to read here because I want to quote her properly because we're journalists by training, if researchers by instinct. In 2017, we only discussed 20 measures. That's 20 of the 192. We only discussed 20 of the measures, which were brought forward to the governor. We had a high volume of measures, but not the capacity to do something with them. The agencies would spend a lot of time putting together those presentations. Then everyone would go back to their offices and continue with their daily work.
Now, well, similarly, New York City's frequently cited mayor's management report most recently ran 339 pages. It included some pretty pictures, but we have friends who can't wend their way through a 300-page best-selling novel. Naturally, this document wasn't intended to be read from cover to cover, but for anyone interested in a citywide overview, it's a pretty hefty tome. In our observations of how this works, it's been important, and we think the key is to prioritize what you're aiming for, being careful at the same time in reporting the information that you're not just publicizing positive information, but really publicizing the whole picture, the negative and the positive.
Currently, all 50 of the states, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of positive information now, all 50 of the states, all the largest cities, and all the largest counties are engaged in some form of performance-related endeavors, at least to some extent. There's a wide spectrum of the skill and capacity with which they do it, but they're all at least trying. But there have been many ups and downs along the way, and that will likely continue to be the case. The lack of sustainability of individual performance measurement systems has to be one of the biggest pitfalls. For example, Minnesota and Maine and Oregon and many other places have all seesawed from role as resolute funders of this work to places where successful programs have been eliminated, and in some cases, new ones have popped up to take their place. Sometimes we've talked with city leaders who proudly tell us that they're just beginning the city's first efforts in performance management. And we know, but they don't, that a similar initiative had taken place 10 or 20 years before.
As time passes, historical knowledge about performance measurements and the positives and negatives of both those experiences are lost to current practitioners. Just a few months ago, we were talking to folks in a large Texas city, which we won't name here. They told us that the first time they had used performance measurement was around 2005. And this was the performance measurement chief. We had actually praised that same city for its better than average efforts in this area in the early 1990s. when we were giving speeches at the biannual performance management conferences being held at the LBJ School of Government at the University of Texas. We want to cite one more danger point that we see in this field. One of the words that's most frequently used in connection with performance management is accountability. Sometimes we feel, and we know we're not alone, that the emphasis on accountability tends to drown out the emphasis on getting to better performance. Certainly, accountability is a good thing and has been the key to many of the so-called STAT programs that gained favor in the first decade and a half of the 21st century. But one of the problems that hurt the effectiveness of some of these programs is when the desire to hold individuals or agencies accountable for the actions turned into a gotcha exercise.
We saw an extreme end of this kind of activity years ago in connection with one of the pioneers in that field, which was New York City's CompStat program. Our daughter was then in the early years of playing soccer, and we like to draw in our work from everything we see in our lives, and our daughter's soccer was mostly what we were doing in those years. Her coach was lieutenant in the New York City Police Department's narcotic division. He was really a tough guy, and he was accustomed to chasing down bad guys in the middle of dark streets in the middle of the night with a gun in his hand. But when he told us about his experiences, and we were really curious about this because we were kind of covering the kind of stuff he was doing, he told us that when the data in his district showed a less than favorable story the night before those meetings, he wanted to throw up. He never said he actually did throw up, but he wanted to throw up. This was, as it happens, the first time we heard anything other than positive programs about the CompStat program, which had actually landed the chief of police on the cover of Time magazine, which didn't help him parenthetically with his continuity as chief of police when Mayor Giuliani wanted to be on the cover. But it wasn't unique. We've since heard about the tensions that the STAT approach has sometimes produced. And when we were working on our book, the one Marc kindly held up, we heard that a great many governments were shifting to a somewhat kinder and gentler approach.
And now, with our time drawing to a close,
Yeah,
and
2 minutes, okay.
2 minutes,
We're good.
we
We're good.
got
We
it.
got this time.
Okay, we just wanted to take something from the chapter in your book and just highlight some of the things that we along the way. One is that the key to success in this field is the recognition that performance management isn't an adjunct to what you do. It's not an extra. It has to be part of the whole fabric of what an agency does. We learned that narrative explanations and storytelling needs to accompany data and measure. Data and measures are absolutely important, but they can't just stand alone. In communication to legislators, it has to be simple and to the point. Networks help. Talking to peers about what they're doing, just as we're doing in this conference, is vital. And building an organized structure so that data measures and evaluations can be easily located, both internally and externally, is really critical.
And another one is be cautious about using incentives or rewards for achieving targets, and think twice before setting targets in the first place. When they're overreaching, they can leave government employees disappointed and less inclined to be involved in the process in the future. You need to train the workforce and the whole workforce, not just the people at the top, but all the way through to understand the value of what they're doing. And of utmost importance, fight to get buy-in up and down the ranks for performance management efforts. Staff resistance can cause all sorts of problems. As a result, employees need to know that performance management is useful to them and has the potential for moving toward better results, ultimately making their jobs more satisfying. Thank you. And Marc, I believe we did 9 minutes and 55 seconds. So we have 5 seconds to go. We yield the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. Thank you, Katherine. I think that was a very valuable, distillation of decades of knowledge, sense that could help anyone around the world. So thank very much appreciated. And okay, we'll now go on to the third presentation by Evan Berman, and then we will come back to everyone for questions. So Evan Berman is professor in public management at the FGV EAESP, which is basically, I think, the most highly ranked private university in Brazil, if I'm right, Evan. And his research areas are public performance and management, comparative public management, and public leadership. His current research interests focus on strategic management and national governments, international practices for increasing the diffusion of innovations, and strengthening employee resilience in the public sector. He's been a colleague of ours for decades and decades, and is one of the most well-informed and insightful scholars in the field. So Evan.
Hey, Mark, thank you so much. I will not be using PowerPoints. Mark asked us to maybe not use PowerPoints, and so this will be the first time in the last couple of years that I'm not using PowerPoint. So thank you for the challenge, Mark. Just before I get started, I just want to thank Arun and Marc for their leadership in making today possible. It's hugely appreciated. The panel so far, what Paja did this morning was just stellar. So this is really a contribution bringing everyone together. I also want to acknowledge, of course, Marc's leadership in public performance. It's fair enough to say that at least half of my career is devoted to this area. And so I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Marc. So hats off, Marc. I owe you very, very much. And I think many people here probably feel the same.
It's mutual.
My comments come from a slightly different place than those that have been previously made. Let me get as quickly as I can to the point. New public management in the 1990s has been phenomenally successful. Yes, as always, when there are new efforts, there will be academics who criticize that. I remember reading an article in the 1990s that new public management or reinventing government in the US was just old wine in new bottles. Well, that turned out to definitely not be the case. The legacy and the performance results of that just continue to live on. And in many countries, they're now saying that they're going through a second round of new public management, which also means to emphasize performance management as well. I think the trajectories are really clear. I mean, today, the use of IT, citizen orientation, accountability, transparency is so much better today than it was 30 years ago. I don't think anybody would doubt that. But when we do talk about the need for sustainability, we're also talking about the experience in a midterm experience that there's a lot of stop and go that cause a lot of frustration. Now, I totally agree with all the practitioners around the world and Paja that having legal foundations is absolutely key. I've done a lot of research in Indonesia. I spent some time in New Zealand and I worked much with them, and they have something like 98 laws on performance management since 1999. And that clearly allows a kind of continuity that goes forward. And you saw that in the presentations from Africa as well. So the legal foundation is clearly important to overcome the changes that come from political turnover, clearly so. But still, there is a lot of stop and go, as the previous presenters just spoke about, and that causes a lot of lost momentum. It causes a lot of frustrations. It causes just a lot of inefficiency. And so that's what I want to focus on, this stop and go in the midterm. It's not the long term, it's not the short term, it's this midterm kind of thing. Now, in an article in 2019 in the International Journal for Public Administration, Marc and other colleagues sort of summarize where we stand in terms of things that are necessary to further sustainability. He pointed out capacity, I guess mostly in America, people focus on local government. I've been focusing on national government for the last 5 or 6 years, and I want to talk about that as well at the end maybe, but that's a different story. But at a local level, having capacity of financial resources to set up performance management systems or deal with data. And Alan, the consequence of big data is also big money, right? So you need money these days, even more than in the past. Having good people, HR, staff has staff skills, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Smaller cities, having people with staff skills can be an issue. Knowledge, also technical knowledge and know-how to make these things work. And buy-in, what Marc calls culture, but other people might also refer to political turnover as well. But culture is also really, really important, of course. Well, to all of this, I just want to add one little data point, is the focus on senior public managers as a critical asset and issue in sustainability. And I want to make a few comments around senior public managers that I've experienced in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Brazil, other countries like so. I think the first thing is around public managers is the need for commitment at very senior levels. And I speak a little bit more now maybe to state government and national governments than to local governments, although I suspect it could be there as well. There's a lot of turnover. Many senior managers in some countries only stay 2 years on the job, maybe 3 years on the job, and then they're promoted to some other position. But we know from management of change and significant efforts, and I think performance management would fall under that when you're trying to influence performance outcomes, that it really does take 4 or 5 years to produce results. You need people who stay with it. And so the idea might be that we need some changes that we can require senior managers to stay on the job through it. Like in academia, department chairs are often appointed and they must stay in that role for 4 to 5 years because it takes that long to lead a department. Now, of course, there's a downside. You could be stuck with a mediocre or a non-performing manager, right? But that is why there's also periodic reviews every 6 to 12 months. And clearly an underperforming manager should not be in the job. But the expectation should be that people should be in the job for, say, 4 or 5 years. And that's not currently the case. There are other areas as well, certainly in hospitals and other kinds of jobs where you expect people to stay on the roll. Cabinet secretaries and ministers are not just allowed to resign, right? They have to get permission to resign. They're expected to stay on, in their job. So dealing with the turnover of senior public managers is really, I think, one of the issues for sustainability and promoting a culture of performance management. Okay, I cannot understand how you're going to get a culture of performance management when you allow people, senior managers, to only rotate through their offices every 2 years. Okay, that's number one. Number two is about back to the future, selecting good senior public managers. There are a lot of senior public managers who may be responsible for giving their portfolio to do something about performance management, but they don't use the full extent of the law and authority that is given to them. They don't know what it is, or they don't have the courage, or whatever it is. There are a study that I did like 20 years ago, which continues to be true, is that not every manager is committed to performance, to say the least. There's a lot of mediocrity out there. I'm not going to talk about bad performing managers. I'm talking about mediocre managers. And the question is, what kind of managers do you need to lead in performance management in certain kinds of organizations, especially state departments or national ministries and like so. And so you need people who will not only be there for 4 or 5 years, you also need them to be committed and knowledgeable, have some know-how about this. And one of the experiences that I've learned from spending 6 years in New Zealand is that, which is, by the way, really governed by a lot of economists. And for a long time, out of the last 20 years, they thought they could hire good public managers on spot market, put an advertisement out there, let people apply and hire. And they came to the conclusion a couple of years ago that that's actually not the case. Public services really do need to also develop their pipeline. I'm not saying you can't just do spot markets, right? There are some good public managers out there that you can hire, but you also have to generate your own pipeline. You need both. It's spot market and pipeline development. So going back to development of public managers is, you live long enough, you see fashions come back, right? So senior manager development, yeah, the time has come back for that again. And when you do have a pipeline development of, echelon, 4, 3, 2, or tier 1, 2, 3, or whatever, the system is in a particular country, you have the opportunity, I think, to develop a culture of performance management and being sure that the people who are then promoted upwards through career boards or whatever actually have demonstrated commitment and knowledge of and use of performance management. So when you then appoint somebody in the position, you're more likely to have such a person who's actually committed to performance management. I think that would clearly be another frontier there. And surely we need more research around that. To what extent, how do mediocre managers use performance management differently from excellent managers who want to make change and impact? Right, that's a good frontier issue there. I think the final thing on senior public managers, especially if they stay there for some years, is the issue of capacity. So going back to Marc and other people's points about well-known capacity issues for finance, HR, leadership, knowledge, culture, that whole thing. What is the capacity then of a particular organizational department for leading in this? Now, some of the best practices, actually, again, that I found in New Zealand was to require chief executives of New Zealand ministries every 4 or 5 years to do a capability review. Now, that sounds like what they did in England, but that was backward looking. This is forward looking. So they asked the question, what is the capacity of my department to achieve for, say, the people of New Zealand or the people of Uganda or the people of New Jersey or whatever it is, right? Looking at different areas, what is the leadership that we have? What is the capability of delivery processes? What are the capabilities of collaboration with other stakeholders? What is our partnership buy-in with other stakeholders? Maybe what is our capability for using big data and open data? What is our capability for using AI? What is the capability of people? What is engagement of people in this department or the turnover thereof? That's a big set of questions, but doing that kind of review every 3 or 4 years allows a senior manager then to say, okay, this is the issue that we're going to run with for the next 2 or 3 years. So different departments will run with different issues over 2 or 3 years and work in that particular area to build the capability for that. And of course, that also allows for thinking about capabilities for performance management, because many of these issues I just raised touch directly on either the use of performance management or the impact that performance management could have.
Hey, Evan, 2 minutes.
Okay, good. Well, just to summarize then, I think so an under-addressed issue. So the job, what's the job of a professor, the chair professor? It is to raise new issues, to articulate some issues on the frontier that may be worth looking at. And so one of these issues I would present to you, where we stand right now, is around better competency and commitment from senior public managers leading this, that they stay on the job longer, that we get people who are knowledgeable and actually committed to performance management, and that they also take a comprehensive view of the capability of their organizations to run with this. So that's my little micro contribution, if you will, small contribution. By the way, and to be asked by Marc of all the wonderful chapters in this book, by the way, right? The book is really good. If you don't have the book, you really should get the book. It's a fantastic book. And like Marc says, the e-version is much cheaper. And so of all the wonderful contributions to be on this panel with the other presenters here, that's really, really, really nice. So thank you kindly.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Evan. So before we move to the questions, I just wanted to comment on a couple of things that were said. One is, as Katherine was saying, in terms of the historical and the knowledge that has been lost, shall we say. That's an excellent point. If we go back to the 70s, let's say, the 80s, there was the book that the feds put together, the Productivity and Handbook for State and Local Government, of which I have a few copies, but it's pretty hard to find. But that was a major compendium. There was it was indicative of an effort to improve, quote, productivity at the time, and then it was lost over. That knowledge base was substantially set aside, lost over the years for lack of political interest, I think. Was also just another example was an excellent book about the New York City productivity program in the 70s and other programs across the country that the Ford Foundation had funded to, millions of dollars invested in that, which the former budget director for the city of New York, wrote for them based on interviews. And the lessons in that book, basically by Frederick O'Rourke, the lessons in that book are still very, very relevant, today. So we need to tap into that historical basis. The second point is really that in terms of building capacity, we don't really see that in performance plans sufficiently. We don't see it in terms of what's going on. There's too much of an emphasis on measurement. too much of an emphasis on systems, but without looking at what Evan says, is what the senior officials need. I would argue that what all of, the middle managers need, as well. So we need to build capacity by focusing on competencies. And very often the public administration curricula across the world don't necessarily focus on capacities enough. There's a whole menu of capacities that we don't really integrate into performance, for example. Things that you need day to day, that problems that you will encounter. It might be human resources, it might be financial, let's say it might be technology, technology related, et cetera. So in terms of performance capacity, building performance capacities, what Professor Trivedi is doing in terms of the Commonwealth programs and what the Secretary General mentioned is, the best program around the world in terms of, methodically building those capacities in the career service. At our National Center for Public Performance, there's these strategic performance management, program. That the certificate program, not a degree program, though there is a specialization within degree, but in terms of what people need, particularly busy people who are on the job who don't have time to get back to school, that type of certification program, certificate program, is an effort in that that direction as well. We need more such programs. So the third point I wanted to mention was that everything we're talking about in terms of GIPRA, in terms of these lessons learned, is really reflected in GAP at one level or another. So there's a pretty good crosswalk between GAP and GIPRA and the performance plans that we have seen. So I think we're getting to the point where we have formulations of things, alternative formulations, which really accomplish the same purposes that could be salient to different governments, different projects, different systems around the world. So Arun, since you are the question master, do you have questions that people sent on chat that you would like to pose to the panel?
Sure, Professor Holzer. Thank you again, panelists. This was a very informative discussion. A lot of insights have been shared, and really goes to the nuts and bolts of performance measurement, especially in local governments. And thank you, Professor Holzer, for the moderation. Yes, we have a lot of questions for the panel. First, I would like to start with the question on how do you incorporate uncertain performance logic with risk logic, and what would be your recommendation? Where does the risk factor come in? Yes.
Anybody on the panel want to pursue that? Performance logic, risk logic. Not sure what the definition of risk logic is in this context, but
I guess also relates to what are the risks in implementing performance measurement, right? Especially if you think of the support or the perspective of the elected official and the timing of the performance measurement systems, if you think of the election cycles and all that. So,
well, perhaps Rich, yes. Yeah. He has to be unmuted, right?
Yes.
I think he's still muted. Well, now I think you're unmuted, Rich.
Good, thank you, Arun. Just a quick stab at it. I not quite comprehending the meaning of risk in that question. I think the biggest risk is for elected officials who will be found to have done not a great job. I think they're the folks who are at risk, and they're the folks who often push back against this kind of work. I don't think it's a risk that society should find acceptable. I think people should be willing to be held accountable for their work, good, bad, or indifferent. But nonetheless, I think that that's where the risk comes in. It doesn't come in necessarily, and it can come in also, there's a risk, there's a secondary risk, because when your elected official isn't happy with the results that are being found, frequently programs, and we discussed this and Marc brought it up again, the programs cease to exist suddenly because we can do it a better way. So that would be my kind of answer.
I want to underscore what Rich is saying, because the problem we ran into several years ago with projects for the Alpha P. Sloan Foundation, where we're trying to encourage performance improvement projects at the local level, is that local officials are very leery of performance programs because they're afraid that some of the, some or maybe more than some of the results measures will be going in the wrong direction. But I mean, to me, that's fine. You might go, you might have found a decrease in performance, which can be diagnosed in terms of problems. You can then try to, remedy that. But they are very afraid of being tossed out by the voters because something doesn't look like it's operating, quote, as it should, whereas the voters don't understand the complexities behind that. The same problem with town managers, that they are leery of performance because they don't want to be seen, they don't want anything to be seen in a negative light. So I think this is a real constraint out there. And we haven't had enough discussion about this sense. So any other comments from Evan or Alan? Alan?
I would just like to chime in with an example. It's not just elected leaders, although what you say is absolutely true. I've seen it very, very often, but it's also just senior managers. It reminds me, there was a time that when we were at Rutgers, we actually were the first school in the nation to actually develop and build an app for the public called My Newark. And it was very interesting because one of the things that we did, aside from providing information, is we were providing the city with valuable data about performance in many, many areas. And boy, it did not go very well. They took it as bad news. They saw this as, well, you're just exposing what we already know. So part of it is how it's sold to senior managers. So here you have people in public works and the highways and all these other people who are seeing this as a threat as opposed to an opportunity. We were there to try to say, boy, you've been complaining for years that this wasn't adequate. You did not have the resources, the manpower to fix all those potholes. Why don't you look at it as a positive to validate what you've been saying? So it's how it is sold is very, very important. This gets into our training and our thinking. Yeah, there's a lot of people, the first knee-jerk reaction is this is bad news. No one wants to hear bad news. But I also believe the glass could be half full, and that is it provides ammunition. It provides a way in which you can resolve things. And I'd rather have good information than no information.
Good point. Okay, Arun, why don't you go on to another question?
Yes, so we have another question, and this question is to Mr. Berman. So the point about mediocre versus exceptional senior managers and the need for strong senior managers to be at the front to support and manage the process. But how do you, I mean, with a system that supports and promotes mediocre, how do you move quickly from mediocre systems to identifying and promoting potentially exceptional senior managers? How do you make the transition? I think this is something that everybody can share too. Yes, Mr. Berman. Sorry.
Well, there are two parts to that question, but one is the easy part that I actually want to deal with is how to identify excellent managers. There's three things. One is in small organizations, you know who the exceptional managers are. It's a reputation. People have a reputation for this. Now, whether you have a excellent city manager or department head who will actually promote excellent people, that's another story, right? But you usually do know. That's number one. Number two in larger organizations, I'm currently working with somebody who's a PhD student, but who's also a former director of the Brazilian Treasury, Ministry of Economy. And in an effort to identify those, the thought has come to give people the opportunities, not the requirement. I do agree with the comment, you can push accountability too far. Give managers the opportunity to present a portfolio that can be evaluated and put forward. The act of putting such a portfolio forward and having that, part of one's HR record and maybe recognized for that helps to identify a cadre of people who are known for excellence in different areas, of course, right? Like so. And it's not about a fine grade measurement like Praja was talking about. It's more like, who are your excellent managers? Who are your really poor managers that you want to watch out for? And who are the ones in the middle? And just getting that kind of categorization is already enough. I'd like to share the screen and put up a photo that I took. Is that possible?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. So this is my entire screen. So let me see if I can just put this up here. Can people see this?
Yes.
Yeah?
You could maximize it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So this is a photo that I took pre-pandemic in Indonesia. What you're seeing here is a person here up front from the Ministry of Administrative Reforms. And they have a program there to promote performance management throughout cities, medium-sized and large cities in Indonesia. What you see here are 700 program directors of medium and large cities in Indonesia attending a 4-day workshop on building logic models, including cross-cutting logic models for programs in their department. Now, to get to this meeting, the mayor of the city has had to agree that the mayor has adopted performance management as a priority for their city, and they have chosen these program directors to travel and to go to Central Java for this particular event by the Ministry of Administrative Reform. They must come back to their city with a logic model that has priorities for improving a particular program in their department. Now, I show this because a photo speaks 1,000 words, right? This is a very rare photo, and I hope the audience will take this in. And this, by the way, this is a result of 8 years capacity building in Indonesia. They didn't start off this way. This is where they ended up after 8 years. And so it shows both, how in a large country you can build up capacity, right? But in terms of identifying managers of excellence or above that, first of all, they are by cities who have that commitment. And the fact that these program directors volunteer to go to this already sets a signal, and some of them will go back and implement that, so you can then monitor that, over a year later, and you start to identify some excellent or committed senior public managers. So if a photo speaks 1,000 words, I think this might be it. And on the right side, you see a breakout room, and then there are smaller breakout rooms, and then they can also meet separately with members of the Ministry of Administrative Reform to tailor logic models or cross-cutting logic models to a particular program, particular effort, and like so. This is very rare.
Excellent example.
I believe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me stop sharing.
So let's just one final question.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Berman. So one question is, has performance management been more successful or for more easily measured programs than in other areas, especially when you call them wicked problems, right? And if so, how can this be addressed, recognizing that these problems are difficult to evaluate and slow to change? So anyone?
So let's see if we get some quick answers from her. So Katherine?
What we have found is that it has been much easier, much more successful at the city level to measure performance and to get buy-in for it, because the services are much closer to the population, much more visible, and that the hardest things to measure are the big policy questions where it is hard to really find the answers that you're looking for. So it has invariably, from our experience, worked better with the simpler, very visible problems that can be that can be more easily fixed.
Okay. Evan?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that and totally agree with that, and just suggest a frontier challenge for where we are right now. In my experience from working around the world right now, we've come to the point that after 20 or 30 years, we have the capacity of cities to actually do certain things. And now we're seeing in many countries that national governments must step up and play their role to help local governments to perform. And then they need to deal with very complex and cross-cutting policy challenges. And the real frontier that I would see right now is how to take cross-cutting challenges into performance management by reforming budget processes at the national level. That, I believe, is, and also from this morning, that I think that is really the frontier, or a frontier cutting issue that we need to address, these complex issues in performance management. Alan, your comment on inter-silo communication is so right on target. But in the context of national governments, you're talking about huge silos across departments and ministries, or whatever the term is. And we need to systemically break through that. A lesson from New Zealand and the federal government in America is that while we do have ways of having team-based collective accountability that Praja spoke to before, there are limits to that. There is the capacity limits of the national government are not sufficiently appreciated, I think. The White House is only that big. The Blue House is only that big. And we now have hundreds of cross-cutting problems that need to be addressed at the national level that cannot be resolved by presidential or prime minister leadership. So we need to reform budget processes and national planning processes.
Yes.
To produce those results. And that's a capacity issue too.
Okay, thank you. So Alan, would you like the last word? No? Okay. All right, so I want to thank the panel. I think that what we have seen here is, that very powerful insights from, some of the leading people in the field who have dedicated decades to really examining what's happening and looking for possibilities. And I think that on balance, what they're suggesting is an optimistic view of what the public sector can achieve and fulfilling promises to citizens. If people working in the public sector actually pay attention to the lessons, actually look up the lessons, and actually apply them. So thank you, panel, and Arun, we will turn it back over to you and to the next panel, and I think we're back on track in terms of time. So
yes, Professor.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Holzer, and thank you, panelists. This has been a really great session. A lot of information, a lot of insights and experiences shared. I just wanted to add about the history part. I would even encourage you to go much further and go back to the 1920s and 30s when we had the municipal research bureaus, and there was a lot of work on performance reporting. So hopefully we see that come back with technology and the focus of data. Thank you again.